if you stress too much, it can actually make your hair fall out.
Dr. Andrew Huberman's insights on stress-related hair loss are an eye-opener in this fast-paced world. Knowing that stress can lead to hair loss is indeed a scientific fact that everyone should be aware of. But fear not, as Dr. Huberman provides a solution through this video that will teach you how to avoid this problem.
There is a tremendously interesting biology surrounding hair, but there's also an incredible psychology around hair. In fact, most people who experience even marginal hair loss undergo pretty severe anxiety.
Our bodies and our minds are so intricately connected. By acknowledging this link between severe anxiety and hair loss, we can prioritize self-care and take steps to manage stress levels.
This may come as a shock, it might seem a little bit esoteric, but head-to-head, topical caffeine application can be as effective as minoxidil application. It is true that our psychological well-being can impact both the coloration, or lack thereof, and the growth rates of our hair. That's a real thing. And the reverse is also true, which is that as hair starts to thin or fall out or change color, many people experience intense anxiety or even depression.
This renowned neuroscientist highlights the complex interplay between our physical appearance and our mental health. As we struggle with hair loss, we might become caught in a negative feedback loop of depression and anxiety, further exacerbating the problem. However, by recognizing this cycle, we can take proactive steps to address both the physical and the emotional components of hair loss.
What we know is that by age 50, approximately 50% of all men and women will have experienced significant enough hair loss that they start to notice it. And a large percentage, up to 85% of those people, will experience some sort of anxiety that leads them to go out and try and either halt or reverse that hair loss. Now, why at age 50? Well, an important point arises from that, which is that the hair loss is not occurring between the 49th and 50th birthday. Hair loss is ongoing from about age 30 to age 50. It's only by age 50, however, that about 50% of people out there start to notice that hair loss. And this is typically because they'll be in a bathroom or looking in a mirror, and the lighting will be bright enough that it permeates the sort of outer boundary of their hair, and they'll notice that their hair is thinning in a particular location. So again, our psychological states can impact our patterns of hair growth or loss, and of course, patterns of hair growth, but more typically hair loss and hair graying, can really impact psychological states.
The doc's groundbreaking research offers hope to countless individuals grappling with hair loss. No longer do we have to passively accept the passage of time and its effects on our appearance. By empowering ourselves with knowledge, we can proactively address hair thinning and recapture our youthful confidence. Age is just a number, as everyone already says, and thanks to Dr. Huberman's pioneering work, we have the tools to redefine our relationship with aging and embrace a future of renewed vitality.
A lot of people think that the hair starts growing right at the surface of the skin. That's not the way it works. The hair is actually growing from deep within the root and stacking up, and then eventually extends out across the top of the skin. That growth phase is called the anagen phase. And this, for some people, will ring a bell, because if you've ever been interested in weightlifting, or even if you're an endurance runner, you'll hear about things that are anabolic, that promote growth, or catabolic, that promote breakdown. So the first phase of hair growth is called the anagen phase, and it's a period of varying duration depending on which hair in the body we're talking about. So the anagen, or the growth phase for hairs on the head, is anywhere from 2 to 8 years. For most people, it's going to be about 6 years. What this means is that if we were to just not cut our hair, just let our hair grow for 2 to 8 years, that hair would eventually grow to a length that it was at its maximum and then would stop growing. So we can say that the anagen phase of hairs on the scalp is 2 to 8 years, right? The duration of the growth phase. Contrast that, for instance, with the duration of the anagen phase for hairs of the eyebrows. The hairs of the eyebrows grow about 4.2 millimeters per month. Believe it or not, people have measured this sort of thing. Different hairs on your body, including the hairs on your scalp, have a growth phase of different duration. This is why the hairs on your head can grow very, very long, because they have a very long anagen or growth phase, and the hairs on your eyebrows will only grow for a few months before they actually fall out. and then have to undergo replication of the stem cells to give you new eyebrow hair to then grow. What's important here is not just that there are differences in the duration of the growth phase, but rather that the rate of hair growth is not something that tends to differ within a given body region, right? You'll hear people say, oh, my hair grows really, really fast. Other people will say, oh, my hair grows really, really slowly. That is probably not the case. While there could be slight differences in the rate of growth, that is the addition of more keratin to the actual hairs, so creation of more hair more quickly, almost certainly what's happening is that the duration of the anagen phase in some people is just much longer than it is in other people. And we don't realize this, and we tend to think more in terms of how fast hair grows, because if you were to just look at somebody's hair, you'd say, oh, they're all more or less the same length. I mean, some people's bangs are shorter than the back because they cut them, but if they were to just grow their hair, you'd say, oh, it's all more or less the same length. But if we were to zoom in with a microscope, we would see that there are a lot of hairs down there in between the other hairs that are very, very short, or even tiny, tiny, tiny. And those are coming in as the other ones are finishing their anagen phase, okay? So that's the anagen or growth phase. After the anagen phase comes the catagen phase. During the catagen phase, the hair is actually receding not from the top down to the skin surface and then into the root, but the other way. It's actually receding from that bulb region up toward the surface. And that catagen phase is going to also be of different duration depending on which area of the body you're in, and it will vary a little bit depending on who you are, meaning from person to person. Why is it important that it actually recedes from the inside out? Well, that's important because as it does that, there's actually a change in that bulb region down below, because normally there's an interface, there's a conversation that's occurring between the stem cell population, the melanocytes, and the hair itself, and they support each other. And remember, there's blood vessels going into that area, or rather capillaries that are feeding that area as well. After the catagen phase comes the telogen phase, which means rest. The telogen phase is a period in which no new hair proteins are being added by those stem cells. In other words, there is no longer a population of stem cells to give rise to more hair after that telogen phase. And there's no longer melanocytes to pigment the hair, and in fact, the hair isn't there anymore, so there's no hair even to pigment after that telogen phase. There are many accelerators on hair growth, but the first one that I really want to underscore is blood flow itself, which equates to the delivery of nutrients and oxygen. This is very important, and it explains a lot of the treatments for halting and reversing hair loss. For instance, one of the longest standing treatments for halting and reversing hair loss is so-called minoxidil. Minoxidil was actually a drug that was developed to treat hypertension. So this is a cardiac drug that lowers blood pressure, and it does that by causing vasodilation. It allows more blood flow, not just to the hairs on your scalp, but to hairs everywhere on your body. And indeed, most people don't realize this, but minoxidil won't just slow the loss of hair from your scalp. It is also effective at slowing the loss of hair elsewhere in your body. How does it do that? Well, you now know one of the major ways it does that. It does that by extending the anagen phase. So it basically makes that phase a bit longer. It doesn't make it much longer, which is why for most people who are losing their hair quickly or who have already lost their hair, minoxidil alone is not going to be a sufficient treatment. However, minoxidil has been shown to be effective at slowing rates of hair loss in people that are starting to experience some hair loss. So that's what minoxidil is doing. It's creating more blood flow to the hairs, which, because minoxidil does have this positive effect, at least most people would like to slow their rates of hair loss on their scalp anyway, it tells you that blood flow and delivery of oxygen and other nutrients from the blood is pretty critical, if not very critical, for the support of the hair growth cycle itself. Minoxidil does have other effects, and this is why dosing of minoxidil becomes a little bit complicated and can be a little bit tricky to troubleshoot. It can greatly lower blood pressure or lower blood pressure just a little bit depending on how sensitive somebody is to that particular drug. So oftentimes physicians will start people on minoxidil dosages that are very low, ideally that would be the case, and then ratchet it up in order to figure out where the minimal effective dose or the kind of critical threshold is beyond which they start experiencing some pretty uncomfortable side effects, such as swelling of the ankles or headaches or dizziness. These things can happen with the use of Rogaine, aka minoxidil. Now, minoxidil has also been associated with increases in the hormone prolactin. Prolactin is a hormone that's released from the pituitary. It is a hormone that acts also as a bit of a neurotransmitter, like many hormones, and it tends to be antagonistic or an opposite to dopamine. So dopamine is a neurochemical. It's actually a neuromodulator, meaning it modulates the activity of a bunch of neural circuits in the brain. It also controls the release of various hormones in the body. Dopamine is almost always associated with states of motivation, pursuit, and drive. It has a little bit of a kind of feel-good element to it, which is why a lot of people think dopamine is associated with reward and pleasure, but it's really about energy, motivation, and drive. Dopamine and prolactin are, as I mentioned before, antagonistic to one another. They're in sort of a push-pull. So people who take minoxidil, especially if they're very sensitive to it or they take dosages that are too high, will experience increases in prolactin that in turn can cause things like reductions in libido, reductions in overall feelings of well-being. In women who take minoxidil, the side effects are much like the ones experienced in men. So there can be swelling, edema of the tissues, because if you get too much vasodilation and too much lowering of blood pressure, that's not good. Headaches, dizziness, and so on. So dosing of minoxidil is really important. If somebody's going to use minoxidil in order to try and slow or reverse hair loss, and again, it mainly is going to be used to slow rates of hair loss, not to actually reverse hair loss, the really key thing is to get that dosage right. The two major brakes on hair growth that we want to think about are PDE, which is a phosphodiesterase. Okay? Anytime you hear ACE, it's likely to be an enzyme, and TGF-beta 2. Right? So this is a particular growth factor that somewhat counterintuitively doesn't stimulate growth. It actually stimulates lack of growth or shortens growth. We all think of caffeine as a stimulant that we drink. I certainly drink coffee and yerba mate, the occasional energy drink, things of that sort. Caffeine does many things besides stimulate our central nervous system and make us feel less sleepy, however. One of the things that caffeine does is it is a fairly potent PDE inhibitor. By being a potent PDE inhibitor, it indirectly stimulates IGF-1. Why? Well, because PDE can suppress IGF-1, and by ingesting caffeine or by applying topical caffeine ointment or cream to the scalp, you can suppress PDE sufficiently enough to increase IGF-1 and increase some hair growth, or at least maintain hair growth in that region. This may come as a shock. It might seem a little bit esoteric, or even outside the margins of typical treatments, but head-to-head, topical caffeine application can be as effective as minoxidil application without actually lowering things like blood pressure and potentially increasing prolactin and some of the other negative side effects of minoxidil. Now, the holy grail of all this hair stuff is in understanding that no one specific treatment is magic. And in fact, there are now a number of good meta-analyses comparing the various treatments we've talked about today alone or in combination. And we can summarize that pretty easily by saying that combination treatments that involve a mechanical stimulus and a chemical stimulus are always going to be better than either one alone. And within the mechanical category, the stimulus that seems to work best is microneedling. So the combination of microneedling and finasteride can lead to some pretty robust and impressive hair regrowth. So much so that people that were, I guess we'd only describe them as pretty bald or bald, can regrow significant amounts of hair. I've never seen examples of people who were completely bald, meaning lacking all scalp hair, to grow back a full head of hair. But the combination of microneedling and finasteride is probably the most effective way to go. People are highly individual in their response and in their side effect profile to these various treatments. But there's an enormous range there, and unfortunately, there's no way to know a priori before doing these treatments what your response is going to be in terms of side effects. So you're simply going to have to explore, and I would hope that you would explore starting with minimal possible effective dosages, and to do that in coordination with a medical professional so you could really evaluate these things at the level of blood and cosmetic changes.